Hello and good morning. Thank you for joining us for the 8th Annual Loan Review Industry Benchmark Survey Results webinar. That's a mouthful, right? It is now 11:30 and it is time for us to get underway. So on behalf of myself, I'm Jim Xander. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing for DiCOM's Software, and my co-host, Costantine, he's our market specialist. We would like to thank you all for joining us. If you are joining us, it means that you're either a DiCOM client, you completed the survey, or you're a friend of DiCOM that has either spoken at an industry event that we participate in, or that you've supported our organization in one way or another. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for your support. Without your support, we really don't have much to say and not much to present, because this survey is really a culmination of all your efforts and all your input. So a little bit about the webinar. First and foremost, just for some of you that haven't joined us previously, this is really all about providing you with industry benchmark data to help you drive continuous improvement within your organization. We also will attempt to offer insights that will provoke thought for the benefit of the loan review function. And what that's really all about is we take the information that you provide us on the survey, we analyze it, we look for key conclusions, and we also color that information whenever possible with information we get from client interactions at our user conference, during prospect demonstrations of our software, and any other industry touch points that we have. So this information is colored by that lens, and we hope that you find it beneficial. We have muted everybody that's on the other end, and that's not because we don't want to hear from you. It's really just to eliminate background noise. To that end, you can submit questions and comments through the meeting chat panel here in the GoToMeeting interface, or you can send those directly to myself via the email that's right there, or to Skip, and we'll be providing our contact information again at the end of the slide deck and the end of this webinar as well. So we certainly do want to hear from you, whether or not it's something you love about the industry survey, some analysis that you thought was fantastic, or something you think we really could have done better on, or maybe should have taken a different perspective on. It's this type of dialogue that helps us continually improve the industry results. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We're going to start off and talk about the survey demographics so you get an idea of who participated and what type of bank sizes participated in our survey. We'll talk about portfolio composition based upon the responses we've got. We'll talk about department staffing, which is definitely an area that we get a lot of feedback and questions on, so we're excited to talk about that as well. And the loan review process, as well as the credit risk management process, and we'll be finishing it up talking about reporting and guidelines. So those are the overarching segments that we'll be discussing during this webinar. And we also did want to point out we've made some adjustments and some improvements, we hope, to the survey based upon your feedback from the last several years. First and foremost, we added a mega bank segment. So we realized that the large bank segment over $50 billion was really too much, provided too much space, and there's too much differentiation within that segment. So we've chopped it up a little bit, and we'll present that throughout this webinar, and you'll get data segmented a little differently. We also collected regional data this year, and we've applied it to the salary analysis, and we could conceivably apply that in different areas as well. So we're excited to talk about the impact of that information. Also, and finally, we've added some performance and productivity questions, and this was based upon some feedback we got again last year from the survey, and also from our clients and just our travels in the industry. What we're hearing is that there's definitely a push towards optimizing your loan review processes, and in doing so, you've got to really put in place some metrics by which you're measuring your performance. So we've asked some questions in that regard and got some analysis there that we're excited to present as well. So at this point, talk a little bit about the demographics and portfolio composition. So here on the left-hand side of your screen, you've got a graph that really illustrates the participation percentages across the various asset ranges that we present the information in. And what you'll see here first is, we've got 7% of the marketplace that's responding to this survey in the $1 to $5 billion range. That's our lowest participation percentage, but our highest number of responses, as you'll see Here, it's a very large segment. So we're happy with that 7%. It's pretty good. And then across the different range as we get from the smaller banks to the largest, the new mega bank segment here, we've got participation percentages above 20% in all categories. And if you happen to be dialing in the $20 to $50 billion range, thank you. Y'all rocked it. We got 50% of that market segment coming in. So really, really pleased with that. So again, thank you for this. This is how we're going to present the information. And if you are one of the 3 respondents that were in the less than $1 billion asset range, please pay attention to the information presented at the $1 to $5 billion segment. That'll be the closest segment that will align with closest to your business. So then we look at loan portfolio sizes, and based on the initial question on the survey, it gives us some information to allow us to present back to you sort of the average portfolio makeup for your asset range. And we find really 2 distinct segments in the marketplace. We see the under $20 billion asset range where CRE is the dominant piece of your loan portfolio. As we get above the $20 billion asset range, we find that C&I starts dominating your portfolios and becomes the biggest piece here indicated in blue. We also find the mega bank segment tends to have a higher percentage of consumer and retail loans for your portfolio as well. So that brings us to the department and staffing section. This is the section that gets really the most feedback and the most dialogue. People get excited about this, and I know that a lot of you all leverage this information within your businesses. So we start off the survey in this section asking about management personnel. And we ask the respondents to delineate your staff in the management sector by whether or not they're performing hands-on review work or if they are literally just management responsible, only responsible for the management function in the department. And we find really some key takeaways here. Really, banks of all sizes, with the exception of a mega bank, are more likely to employ a larger percentage of hands-on managers. So your managers are typically more likely to do hands-on review work at really all asset ranges except for the largest. And then you really get a continuum here as bank size increases, as does the number of management personnel increase as well, where you max out here around 6 or 7 managers with a pretty even split between department managers and hands-on review managers here in the mega bank sector. If we look at junior and senior review staff levels, we also have some key takeaways here. What is the distinction between junior and senior level staff members? If you don't remember from the survey, the junior staff members are the individuals that will require some sort of assistance to complete a file, essentially, in loan review. While senior staff members, someone that can complete a review without really any supervision. So that's the major distinction there. And what we find here is that banks of all sizes are more likely to employ a larger percentage of senior staff than junior staff. And this is due to probably a number of factors based upon dialogue I've had with Skip. It's a lot due to, loan review function, you need seasoned employees. It's a very critical function. And, that would dictate the need for more senior staff and junior staff. But also we know through our travels and discussions that new staff members are just hard to find and hard to hire and hard to attract. So that's another thing that we think is causing this challenge. So then what we finally did is we stacked all the information together, the management staff, hands-on and management only, junior level staff and senior level staff in this chart, and give you an estimate of really entire department size, which doesn't account for admin or specialty staff, but it gives you an idea of, how big should my department be if I'm, essentially staffed like others in my asset range. And you get this continuum here. You also can use this information to help plan for growth. If you have an acquisition coming up where you realize that you're going to grow your portfolio by X%, or if you're in organic growth mode and you're going to cross, say, from 20 billion to you're going to get to target 23 billion, you might find along this continuum how you can increase your staff to stay right-sized with your growth. Then we also look at average years of experience by staff level, and we break this down by asset size. And we find that a couple key takeaways here, something that's not super surprising, junior staff tend to be less experienced than senior staff, which tend to be less experienced than management staff. We find that information clearly detailed here, but we also see that as bank size increases, as does the propensity to hire more experienced personnel. We also find that same sort of trend here with salary levels. We find that, again, junior staff members don't make as much as senior, which don't make as much as management staff. Well, we also find that, as salary or as bank size increases, the salary tends to increase in line with that. We also find that, which was interesting, I did a quick little calculation on average years of experience at a small bank, average years of experience at a large bank, and then divided the salaries by that information. You find that actually it's not so much that large banks are paying their people more just because they're paying a premium. Find that really most banks are paying about the same amount. They're just paying the same amount for years of experience with potential increase with asset size. So a little fun little analysis I did there that I don't know if anybody enjoyed on the other line, but I did. One other thing that you get from this analysis is also some average salary range, kind of some national averages. And if you look at the junior staff levels here at the small banks, around 54,000, all the way up to 97,000 at the largest banks. So that gives you an idea of kind of where should I fit along this continuum based upon my bank size. Senior staff looking at about 82,000 to 126,000, while management staff rounds out around 114,000 to 151,000. So we get a lot of insight and a lot of questions on that type of analysis. So this year, as I mentioned, we got regional data. So we have city, state, location information of all the survey respondents. And what we then did is me and Skip talked about how can we best segment this information and present back some salary information based upon the regional information we have. And Skip said, hey, why don't we use the 12 Federal Reserve districts, which are outlined here on this slide, ranking from District 1 all the way to District 12 here on the West Coast. And I think that was a good idea. So we'd love for your feedback as we present these next several slides as to how you like the regional analysis and if you'd like to see us, refine that in any ways. But I thought it was pretty telling. What we find here is a continuum of salary ranges for junior staff members from District 1, here the highest paying district on the left, and then District 8 being the lowest paying district. And what we find really is that District 1 salaries are about 64% higher than District 8 salaries. So if you're doing a salary analysis and providing that back up to management, you can start incorporating some of this regional data in line with the asset size data that we have on the previous slides. We get some similar data here with senior staff salaries. Again, District 1 being the highest paying district, and here now District 4 being the lowest paying district, which when you compare the two, there's about a 54% differential. So very highly related to region salaries are. And we get the same thing with management salaries as well. We get a continuum of $141,000 all the way down to $90,000 comparing District 1 and District 4. And that's a 56% differential. So when you compare now the regionality with the asset range, it gives you a better salary picture than we've been able to provide previously. So we hope you'll find this information helpful and certainly welcome your feedback. And at this point in time, I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to let Skip talk a little bit about bonus eligibility.
Thank you, Jim. So Loan Review has the opportunity to earn additional money above what their standard salary is. So bonus payout, when we looked at it, it hasn't varied much since last year. In 2019, 88% of the respondents are eligible for some type of bonus. And in 2018, 87% of the respondents were eligible for a bonus. So it divides up along a pool bonus. And then there's a smaller segment that has incentivized type bonuses. This slide seems to tell an interesting story about exposure per reviewer and the workload. We asked about the average C&I and CRE exposure per reviewer. Exposure per staff reviewer increases with the size of the bank. All banks are showing a notable increase in exposure since 2016. Portfolio penetration percentages have been relatively constant, which we will talk about later in this webinar. This would suggest there's an increased workload on staff. 3 survey respondents I called to sign up for this webinar and completed the survey actually told me they were too busy to attend the webinar. But I'm glad they took the time to do the survey. They just seem to be real busy. So it would appear loan reviewers are doing more work given the increased loan portfolios per staff member. What we see here is that once you get to the larger bank size, you get the higher chance of having admin support. All bank sizes reported they do training for loan review, with the larger banks reporting that they do more training. So the annual training budget for loan review didn't change much since last year's survey. About 1/3 report no budget, and 1/3 report about $500 to $1,000. So the budget would be between $500 and $1,000 for staff training. Jim.
Okay. I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar that we started asking questions about loan review productivity. So this is our first pass, and this very high-level question asks a couple things. It asks, one, are you measuring productivity within your loan review department? If so, what metrics are you looking at? If you're not looking at metrics at this present time, are you planning on doing that within the next 12 months? And if not, then you fall into the category that you're just not tracking metrics and have no plan. So what we have here on this slide is really a delineation of 62% banks are tracking metrics. So the majority of banks are currently tracking productivity metrics. We find that credits per reviewer is the most widely used metric, and it's been kind of the de facto standard for when we have conversations with existing clients and others in the industry. That is the one we always hear. Now, we always do hear that there's a challenge with this metric because it doesn't really take into account complexity or type of credit, and not all credits are created equal, and some are more difficult and take more time to review. So what we've always tried to do is figure out how do we temper that, and we added a response to the question that perhaps total exposure per reviewer would also give kind of that second way, that second lens of looking at productivity. We figured that higher, larger exposure might indicate complexity. So that was our thought. However, nobody's really using that metric. So we'll continue to keep that as a response and see if folks begin to adopt that metric or find a new one that works better. That brings us to 16% of the respondents are looking at other metrics, and we analyzed the comments in this section, and we really didn't find any great metric that, oh man, everybody's looking at this. So unfortunately, we got a kind of hodgepodge here, and we'll continue to look at that and see if we maybe missed a trend there. And we also find that 15% of respondents may not be tracking metrics now, but do have a plan to do so in the future. So we expect to monitor this next year and see a higher percentage here in the reviewing credits per reviewer, most likely. So we further slice this information and look at it from a perspective of asset size. And we find really there's almost like two segments of the industry. There's the small to mid-sized banks that are a little better than 50% likely to be tracking metrics. And then we find the large banks that there's a higher propensity to be tracking productivity metrics. And then we also find, again, across the asset ranges, a good percentage indicated here in blue that plan to track these metrics. So again, we'll continue to monitor this, and we're very, very pleased with the results we got and hope that you found this to be beneficial. We also asked another question, albeit not as clearly as we would have liked, which is around number of files reviewed per week during an exam. And we asked the question just that way. What number of files are reviewed per week during an exam? And we didn't specify whether or not it was per reviewer or by department. However, a lot of you that filled out the survey provided the information in the comment section that said, we're doing this calculation by reviewer. So I've extracted all that information and filtered by only those responses that indicated by reviewer to make sure we didn't pollute the data, and it really did work out about exactly the way we thought, and based upon the dialogue we've had with clients at the user conference and other experiences, we find that really we've got a range of around 6 to 4 or 5 on the low side files reviewed per week by reviewer. And we also find there's a little bit of a distinction between the smaller to mid-sized banks, numbers a little bit higher, around 6 on average, and we find closer to 5 on average for the larger banks. And we would say this is largely accounted to the complexity of credits. As the bank size increases, the complexity of credits is likely to increase to a certain extent, which means that those that are reviewing those credits will get through less per week. So this gives you a pretty good benchmark. If you're around 5 or 6 credits per week per reviewer, you're doing a pretty good job, and you're pretty efficient, or at least by standards today. The section highlights, banks of all sizes are more likely to employ a larger percentage of senior staff compared to junior staff. Salary and experience levels trend up as bank size increases. Salary in higher paying districts can be 50% greater, more than 50% greater than in lower paying districts. Asset exposure per reviewer increases as bank size increases, and exposure per reviewer is trending up in all asset sizes, and it would appear that portfolio growth is outpacing staff growth. And the average number of files per reviewer each week is between 4 to 6. The larger banks on the lower end and the smaller banks tend to be on the higher end, closer to 6. So at this point, we'll move on to the loan review process. Okay, we ask a question on whether or not our survey respondents are outsourcing loan review or if they've internalized this function. And we find that across all asset ranges, banks are more likely to internalize the loan review function than to outsource it. And we also find that as bank size increases, the likelihood to outsource drops as well, consistent with what we found last year also. And then we also look at what is the motivating factor for those banks that do outsource the review function. And we find that cost savings was the primary motivator last year, indicated here in blue, and also this year indicated here in orange. We do find that flexibility has increased considerably, and we've also found that independence dropped considerably this year. So we'll monitor this and see if this is in fact a trend or if this is just a data anomaly from one year to the next. Now, as we talk about primary objectives of loan review, I'll turn it over to Skip for a few.
And give you a break. The primary objectives of loan review, the first 2 there, as you can see, are risk rating and asset quality, and they remain unchanged since the prior year, and that's really not a surprise to me. And then it's followed up by underwriting. Where is loan review performed? Generally, it's performed at the primary office or some type of off-site office of the institution. The benefit, I think, of doing it at the home office is team members can learn from each other, and you have a knowledge transfer that takes place from senior examiners to junior loan reviewers. When I did loan review, we sat around a big table in the boardroom, and 25-year examiners passed their information on to me. That's how I learned much of what I did in loan review. When scheduling a review, risk-based scheduling is slightly ahead, followed closely by targeted reviews. It would seem logical that risk-based scoping has increased since last year, as loan review has to be more efficient with larger portfolios, while the staff appear to remain somewhat static. In second place, you have targeted portfolios. I think that speaks to regulatory concerns of well-managed concentrations. As mentioned in the previous slide, a risk-based approach is the most popular approach. As this slide reflects, most asset size use some type of risk-based approach. Reviewing at the relationship level. This is similar to last year. If you're doing risk-based scoping, you would probably want to look at the entire relationship, especially the larger ones, or even the larger borrowers for risk-based scoping. Or you can do targeted reviews by borrowers and individual notes if you have to look at a concentration or something in the economy might prompt you to do a targeted review. Types of loans in review are commercial, over there on the left, the larger ones, commercial, CRE, and construction. Those are on the top three of the review. We added leverage loans because there was talk about these types of loans in the media. Although these types of loans don't appear to be an issue for banks, there is concern about loans that have been securitized. I'm reminded of the presentation that Deb Stryaszek did at our annual users conference on EBITDA. It's been recently reported that leverage for buyouts has been increasing. I think it's somewhat over 6 times now. So I'm going to be watching this sector a little bit closer, and now we have a data point to track to see what happens. And Jim, I think it goes back to you.
It surely does. All right. We also asked a question about the most popular sample selection criteria used by loan review staff, and we find there's some consistency year over year here. The top 5 responses have remained relatively consistent year over year, and we find that large borrower is number 1 year over year, with 97% of folks this year indicating that's one of their prime sample selection criteria. We also find problem watch list loans, new loans, a risk-based selection, as well as past due status, kind of rounding out those top 5. And this is in line with what we see during our user conference, as well as our demonstrations of CQS. So again, no surprises there, and we'll continue to monitor this and see if it adjusts year over year, but it's been fairly consistent. We also look at the risk assessment criteria that's evaluated, and what we find is credit quality is the number 1, and not a shocker. That's how you all keep your lights on and your salaries paid. Good credit quality pays the bills, and 98% of survey respondents would agree. Then we look at concentrations, again, being fairly significant, with exception levels, prior year loan review results, and portfolio segment growth, which actually grew this last year, and size of portfolio also being significant there as well. Then, as Skip mentioned, we were going to talk about portfolio penetration percentage. So here we are. These numbers are very, very similar to last year's numbers. So not a big distinction between coverage percentages, but really a lot of the same takeaways here, where these smaller banks tend to be looking at about 45% of your portfolio, all the way down to the mega banks here, looking at less of the total portfolio here with about 30%. So these are consistent with last year's results and give you some good benchmarking information. You can look at, are we looking at about the same as our peer group, or are we looking at a little more, a little less, and how do we calibrate on that? So we also look at what level exceptions are cited, and we're looking at this from a trending standpoint, as we find that more and more folks are talking about doing things at the relationship level. However, still to this day, we find there's really 2 distinctions. Really smaller banks are favoring, still citing exceptions at the note level, while the larger banks then tend to favor citing at the borrower level, with really a small percentage across the board citing exceptions at this present time at the relationship level. And that's, we talk a little bit about why would that be, and perhaps granularity of reporting and things of that nature would be the primary factor driving that. Then we also look at how exceptions impact a review rating, and we look at this information compared with 2019 here in blue and 2018 here in orange, and we find the results fairly similar year over year. And consistently, we find that most banks are citing all your exceptions, but really only considering material exceptions that impact a review rating. So that's been consistent for really the last 4 years or so. And then we get to an area that's near and dear to me and Skip's hearts here, as we look at whether or not our survey respondents are utilizing some form of loan review system, or if still using manual processes such as Excel and Word to perform your loan review process. And we find that really in the smaller bank sizes here, that more likely and more apt to be performing manual processes And as asset size trends up, really once you cross the threshold of 10 billion, you find that banks are more likely to be leveraging a system for their process. And as you go across the board here, you find 100% of the mega banks are utilizing a loan review system based on our responses here. So then we look at the information a little differently, and we split it out whether or not survey respondents are leveraging a vendor-supplied system such as DiCOM's CQS, or if they're utilizing an internally developed custom system. And we find really there's, along the continuum, there's kind of different stories here. First, in this $1 to $10 billion range, we find that most of the banks are either evaluating or the early adopters are implementing a system at this point in time. And then you find here in this range above, 10 to 50 billion, you're finding we're most likely to buy a system at this point. These large banks that are 50 to 100 billion, a lot of resources, internal IT and development resources, most likely to build a system. And then when we see a little bit of a drift here when we get to the largest banks, over 1 billion, and what we find anecdotally and what the data would suggest is there becomes a decision then, as the bank has grown, do we refresh our manual process or our custom-based system? Do we invest a lot of time and effort in our process refresh, or do we buy a system? And that's where you see a more significant number utilizing a vendor-supplied system. So this section highlights here, we find that all banks above $1 billion are more likely to internalize their loan review function. However, those that do outsource, cost savings is the primary motivator. Targeted portfolio penetration decreases as bank size increases. Smaller banks are somewhere around 45% penetration as a percentage of total outstandings, while larger banks are closer to 30%. The likelihood to utilize a manual loan review process trends down as asset size increases. And all but the largest banks are more likely to buy than build, with the mega banks look like there's a little bit more of a shift back towards a vendor-supplied automation system. So at this point in time, we'll talk about the credit risk management process, and I'll turn it over to Skip for a few.
Thanks, Jim. Okay. ALLL. Loan review mostly either does not get involved, what we found in the ALLL, or their involvement is on the periphery with activities like impairment calculations, specific reserves, and attending meetings. I found these in the comment sections, and I really appreciate when you take time to enter comments and we can share this information. It gives even more insight. Other responsibilities. It seems loan review has additional responsibilities. The primary additional responsibility is acquisition due diligence, and we've seen a lot of M&A these past couple of years. The secondary additional responsibility is preparing and managing regulatory exams. And then back to the comment section, they reflected additional duties of loan review, and I think these warrant some mention. Loan review has to author/write up quarterly risk assessments for every industry. They have to do vendor analysis and portfolio analytics and stress testing, looking at floor plans and field audits. I guess that gets you out of the office once in a while. So that's further evidence that loan review is very busy. 1D versus 2D risk ratings. As the smaller banks typically use the 1D rating, and then as it crosses the $20 billion asset threshold, the 2D ratings you see more frequently implemented. And as Jim has a slide that's near and dear to his heart, this slide is near and dear to my heart. The loan review manager has the final say in the risk rating. So that was the same result we had last year and this year. Does your bank image credit files? So we established most banks do image credit files, so we wanted to see with what accuracy are the files. Basically, 6 reported less than 5% of the documents are missing, and 18% reported between 5 and 10% of the documents were either missing or misfiled. When I worked in the examination world, we thought the number was a lot higher, But then when we became acquainted with the system, we realized that seems about right. That's a little examination humor. So with collateral files, we found similar results. With 67% reporting, less than 5% of the documents are missing, and 20% reporting between 5 and 10%. And collateral is very important, so you don't want to lose that. Section highlights. Additional responsibilities of loan review, acquisition due diligence is a common responsibility. And also the data suggests they're being asked to do more. 1D risk ratings are still the norm for banks under $20 billion. The loan review manager has the final say in loan grading. And most banks are imaging collateral and credit files, and less than 5% of the documents are missing. And loan review is involved in the ALLL as far as helping with the accuracy of the ALLL. So we're going to throw it back to Jim to take us home with reporting and guidelines.
Awesome. We are on the home stretch here. All right. We begin this section looking at the common reporting lines for loan review. And we look at different options here from CRO to board of directors, chief credit officer, CEO, et cetera. And we found that this year, over the past 3 years, it's been most commonly board of directors committee other than audit, both from a direct and indirect reporting relationship. We see these two swap, and chief risk officer is now the most popular reporting line for loan review, and we're curious to see if this was a slight data anomaly based upon the respondents or if this is a new trend. We also found that board of directors audit committee was a fairly substantial reporting line, and then everything else is a little bit better than noise. Director of internal audit becoming one option, and chief credit officer and CEO more likely to be indirect reporting options. Then we look at management reporting across the various functions here on the left-hand portion of the graph. And we really find that management reporting can be broken up into two segments based upon these results. We find that the line of business management and executive management, very similar results where detailed reports are likely the case. We find these detailed reports provided at a monthly frequency to be the most common response for both of these. So very high level of detail and frequency for this segment, these two different reporting lines. And then we find that the Risk Oversight Committee, the board, the Audit Committee, and the Board of Directors all most likely fit into a different segment where you're looking at providing some sort of reporting, not at the same level of detail, so summary reporting at a quarterly basis, so less frequency as well. So really two different segments there. We also look at the acceptable level of criticized loans. And based upon the survey responses, we get some averages. And we find that really, except for this $50 to $100 billion range, which we find is a little bit of an outlier, that the ranges most average about between 3 and 5%. So this is the most common. If you fall within this range, you're in good company. Then we look at classified assets, and we tweaked this question a little bit this year based upon your feedback. We used to look at it as a percentage of total outstanding. This year we look at it as a percentage of Tier 1 capital plus the ALLL. And we find this data really suggests that responses average range around 12 to 19%. However, we did find that a number of banks reported as high as 40%, and then most of our respondents were under 10%. So based upon those two different ranges, we get an average of about 15% for a benchmark. So that information presented a number of different ways. And then if we look at the highlights here, most common reporting lines for loan review are the Chief Risk Officer, which is a fresh #1 this year in comparison to last year, which was Board of Directors Committee other than audit. Loan review typically provides detailed reports to the line of business and executive management, and typically done on a monthly basis. The average level of acceptable criticized loans is 3 to 5% as a percentage of total outstanding. An average acceptable level of classified loans as a percentage of Tier 1 capital in the ALLL is approximately 15% for benchmarking purposes. So if we take all the information we have and we kind of bundle it up into really the recurring themes and conclusions, the key takeaways here. First and foremost, you've heard Skip say it, you've heard me say it, and I think we get it too for you all. Loan review staff are being asked to do more. Exposure per reviewer is increasing. Penetration percentages are constant. Additional responsibilities are becoming more common, and these additional responsibilities are acquisition due diligence, portfolio analytics, and quarterly risk assessments. We also find that loan review talent pool is comprised primarily of seniors, and attracting new talent seems to be challenging for all bank sizes. Tracking performance metrics is becoming the norm. Files per reviewer per week is sort of the standard metric, and the target should be above four files a week, and up to 6 tends to be the highest level reported. And what we're seeing here is there's a very real need to optimize loan review and the supporting processes. And you know, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that's what DiCOM does. So if you're feeling the pressure and you're having challenges doing all your work as your bank has grown or as more responsibilities have been piled up upon you, give me a call and let's just talk and chat about what some of your challenges are and see if it makes sense to continue a dialogue and see if there's something that DiCOM provides, from loan review optimization all the way up to portfolio risk reporting and analytics. If those things could help your business, give me a call. That's what I do, so I'd love to talk to you and see if we can solve some of your problems. So as we conclude this, we've got some follow-up items that are on me and Skip here. And first and foremost, we plan to distribute the full slide deck to all participants. We will do this in the next couple of days. I would ask that feel free to share it within your organization, but I'd ask you not to share it too freely outside of your organization at this point in time, because we will be holding another webinar which will be industry-wide. It's not an invitation only, so we'd hate to kind of ruin that the desire for people to attend that. We also will be working on the white papers. For those of you that consume our white papers, Skip and I will be working on those, and we'll have those out by early quarter 4. We'll do our best to do it sooner, but we'll definitely have them out by early quarter 4. And if you want to look at last year's white papers, visit our website. They're all out there, and there's some good information that's still relevant. And also, stay current on the latest things that we're putting out. Me and Skip post a lot of things on LinkedIn that, you know, not really just sales and marketing stuff, but sometimes, you know, industry thoughts and some of our analysis. So we'd love for you to LinkedIn connect up with us, and also follow DiCOM Software. A lot of good stuff that we put out on LinkedIn. And please contact Skip and I with any questions, comments, or any next steps, anything you found interesting or you want us to look at differently. Let us know. We love your feedback, and as you can see, year over year we're incorporating your feedback and improving the survey. Here's our contact information. Don't be shy. Call the DiCOM main number, ask for me, or, you know, send me or Skip an email. We'd love to hear from you, and really thank you for taking time out of your schedules. Clearly, some of the takeaways, we know that you're very busy and you got a lot on your plate, so taking time out of your schedules to join us and listen to us, we really do appreciate it, and thank you for your support. So at this point, we're going to conclude the webinar. Thank you very much.